The gift was wrapped in yellow, not because I had planned the color. Yellow was simply the paper I had in the house, the roll I had bought 2 Christmases ago and had been using for everything since. I had not thought about the color. I had thought about the card. The card took me 4 days to write, not the language. The language came quickly, the way things come when you have been carrying them for a long time and finally arrive at the moment of putting them down. What took 4 days was the decision about whether to put it in the envelope at all, whether the shower was the right moment, whether there would ever be a right moment, or whether I was waiting for a right moment the way you wait for things that do not arrive on their own. I had brought it anyway. I had sat in a row of women I mostly did not know, Sophie's college friends, her work colleagues, her mother-in-law's circle, in my sister's living room with the yellow wrapped gift in the pile with all the others. I had a glass of sparkling water. I do not drink at my sister's events, a decision I made 3 years ago for reasons I will explain. Not because I cannot handle a glass of wine, but because I had understood that I needed to be clear-eyed at gatherings where my mother was also present, where the atmosphere was social and therefore the guards were down and therefore things got said. Things had been said before. I had been a glass of wine in and not positioned to receive them properly. I had listened to the room be warm and celebratory in the way of baby showers. There is a specific warmth to them, the warmth of women gathered around the fact of new life, which has a quality of generosity to it that does not always appear in other kinds of gatherings. People are softer at baby showers. The occasion requires it. I had been sitting with that softness not quite inside it. You cannot be inside it when you are also monitoring the room, but near enough to feel it, near enough to want it, when my sister turned to me from across the space. Sophie was beautiful that afternoon. I want to say that plainly. 28 weeks pregnant, round and certain of herself, wearing a dress she had bought for the occasion. Sage green, the color she looks best in, which I know because I have known her for 28 years. She had a glass of juice. She had been laughing. She turned to me and she said, loudly enough for the room, "You should be grateful we even invited you, after everything you put Mom through." She was 28 weeks pregnant, round and glowing in the specific way that pregnancy sometimes produces, wearing a dress she had bought for the occasion. She had a glass of juice. She had been laughing at something someone said. She looked at me. She said, loudly enough for the room to hear. Loudly enough, I think, that she intended the room to hear, "You should be grateful we even invited you, after everything you put Mom through." The room went the way rooms go. The specific, suspended quiet of 22 women who have all just heard something that should not have been said in a room and are deciding, simultaneously, whether to acknowledge that they heard it. I sat with my sparkling water. I did not respond. I did not stand up. I did not look away from her exactly. I held her gaze for 1 second, 2, long enough that it was not avoidance, and short enough that it was not a challenge. Then I looked down at my glass. The room recovered, the way rooms do. Someone said something. The moment was absorbed into the fabric of the afternoon, the way uncomfortable moments at parties get absorbed. The shower continued. My gift was near the bottom of the pile. When she opened it, she smiled at the yellow paper. She turned it over, looking for a tag. There was no tag. She glanced around the room in the way you do when you are trying to identify a gift's origin, but nobody claimed it because I did not raise my hand, and she did not think to look at me. She opened it. She read the card inside. She started shaking. My name is Vivian Osei. I'm 31 years old. And before I tell you what was in that card, I need to tell you what Sophie meant when she said everything you put Mom through, because those words are the entire story. That sentence is the reason the card existed, and the card is the reason that afternoon changed everything. If you have ever been the person in your family who absorbs blame for things, you did not cause the person whose name is attached to a version of events you were not responsible for. This story is for you. Stay with me. My mother's name is Catherine Osei. She is 61 years old, and she is a woman who has spent her adult life being the center of her own story in the specific way that some people are. Not maliciously, not with calculation, but with the genuine conviction of someone who has decided, somewhere along the way, that their feelings are the most important feelings in any room they occupy. My father left when I was 9 and Sophie was 6. He did not leave dramatically. There was no fight I was old enough to witness, no scene I can point to and say, "This was the moment." He became increasingly absent over the course of about a year and then became entirely absent, which is one of the specific ways that leaving happens when the person leaving is not brave enough to do it clearly. My mother's response to this was to become the center of her own story in a way she had not been before. She had been defined before that year by her role as wife and mother. The removal of the wife part required the mother part to carry more weight, and my mother carried it, genuinely at real cost with real sacrifice. She worked, she stayed, she provided. She did not collapse. What she also did was require her daughters to witness the not collapsing, to serve as the audience for her endurance. I was 9, and then 10, and then 11, and the role I was asked to play was the role of witness to my mother's strength, which was also, by extension, witness to my father's abandonment, which was also, by extension, a performance of loyalty. Sophie was 6 when he left. She learned the story from my mother, which meant she learned a story in which endurance was the primary virtue and the primary evidence of love. She learned to be grateful for the endurance. She had the softer, easier relationship with our mother, partly because she was younger, and partly because she was more naturally inclined toward gratitude, and partly because she had learned the lesson better. I had not learned the lesson in the same way. This narrative was not untrue. She had raised us mostly alone. She had worked and sacrificed and endured. All of that was real. What the narrative did not include was what the raising had looked like from inside it, from the inside of being the older one, the one who was expected to be capable, the one who had absorbed the responsibility that my father's leaving had created without anyone asking whether a 9-year-old could carry it. I want to be careful here. My mother is not a cruel person. She did not hit us or starve us or deprive us of material things. What she did was more subtle and in some ways harder to name. She needed us to reflect her suffering back to her. She needed our presence to be evidence of her sacrifice. She needed us, particularly me. Sophie was younger and easier and more naturally inclined toward the performance of gratitude, to acknowledge, regularly and specifically, what she had given us. When I was 17, I stopped performing. Not deliberately, not as a statement. I was 17 years old and I was going through the ordinary, difficult process of becoming a person. And at some point in that process, I stopped being able to look at my mother and say the things she needed to hear, not because I didn't feel them, but because I had started to notice that what she needed from me was not love. Exactly. It was a particular kind of love. Love as acknowledgement, love as debt repayment. I could not pay the debt the way she needed it paid. I did not have the language for this at 17. I just stopped performing, and my mother experienced the stopping as abandonment. What followed, across the next 14 years, was the accumulated consequence of that stopping. My mother told Sophie things. I am not going to detail all of them, because some are private, and some I only have secondhand. What I can tell you is that Sophie grew up in a version of our family history in which I was the difficulty, the one who had made things hard, the one who had not appreciated what our mother had done, the one who, when our mother had needed support, had turned away. Sophie had not been there for the turning. Sophie had been a child and then a teenager and then an adult, receiving information about a version of her older sister that had been assembled by the person with the most access and the most grievance. She had believed it. Why wouldn't she? She loved our mother. She had no competing information. I had tried, at various points, to provide competing information. The results had been mixed. At 23, I had tried to talk to my mother directly about what I had experienced growing up. The conversation had lasted 40 minutes and had ended with my mother in tears, and me being told that I was rewriting history and that she had given everything and I was ungrateful and had broken her heart. Sophie had called me the next day and said, "Mom called. She's devastated. Why do you do this to her?" I had said, I was trying to have an honest conversation. Sophie had said, "Some things don't need to be said." I had understood then that there was a version of this I was not going to be able to correct through conversation, that the story had been running long enough and had been told to enough people that it had calcified, that I was the difficulty in this family's account of itself, and that being the difficulty was a role that would not be relinquished without something more than my saying, "Actually, that's not what happened." I had stopped trying to correct it directly. I had not stopped paying attention. 3 years before the baby shower, something happened that I had not expected. My Aunt Patricia, my mother's older sister, a woman I had always been close to who had been a point of warmth and sanity in my childhood in the specific way that an aunt can be when the parent is not quite enough, my Aunt Patricia called me. She called on a Thursday evening. She said, "Vivian, I want to tell you something. I don't know if I should, but I've decided I'm going to." She told me that she had been talking to my mother, that our mother had been talking to a lot of people in the family, their cousins, my grandparents before they passed, the extended web of the family, about me, about what I had put her through, about the pain I had caused. She had been having this conversation, apparently, for years, and Aunt Patricia had been listening for years and had finally reached the point where she could not listen anymore without saying something to me. "Your mother has told everyone that you abandoned her," Aunt Patricia said, "that you cut her off, that you chose your friends over your family, that you said things to her that were unforgivable." I was quiet. "I've been in the room for some of these conversations," she said. "I've heard what she says. And Vivian, I've also known you your whole life. The person she describes is not the person I know." I said, "What does she say?" She told me. I sat on the edge of my bed in my apartment and I listened to my aunt describe for 35 minutes the version of me that my mother had been distributing through the family network for the better part of a decade. The details were specific. Some of them had grains of truth. I had stopped calling every week, which my mother characterized as cutting her off. I had, at 23, raised concerns about my childhood in a conversation that my mother characterized as a vicious attack. I had, at 26, declined to attend a holiday gathering that my mother characterized as a public rejection. Each event had happened. Each interpretation was my mother's. I had not been in the room for the distribution. I had not known the scale of it. When my aunt finished, I said, "How long has this been going on?" She said, "As long as I can remember." I asked her one more question. I asked whether Sophie knew, whether Sophie had heard these conversations, or whether what Sophie believed about me came primarily from our mother directly. Aunt Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sophie has been in some of those conversations, Vivian. Not all of them, but some." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my apartment for a long time. I had understood before that call that my mother had a version of events that was different from mine. I had not understood that the version had been actively distributed, that it had been told to aunts and cousins and my sister and whoever else was available, that I had been, across a decade, being made smaller, in rooms I was not in. This is when I started keeping records. I am not a person who keeps records naturally. I am not organized by disposition. I keep my apartment in a state my closest friend Nadia describes, affectionately, as organized chaos. I lose my keys. I forget to respond to emails for days. But I understood after my aunt's phone call that I was in a situation that required documentation. Not for legal purposes. I was not thinking about anything legal. For clarity. For the specific clarity that comes from having things written down rather than only remembered, which is a different kind of knowing. The kind that holds up under pressure. I started a document on my laptop. I titled it simply, Notes, because I did not want to give it a name that would feel dramatic if I read it later. I set the font to something ordinary and the formatting to something plain, because I was writing this for clarity and not for posterity, and I did not want it to look like something I had been building toward. I began to record things. I recorded the conversation with Aunt Patricia first, the entire 35 minutes of it, reconstructed as accurately as I could manage, while the details were still fresh. I recorded the specific incidents she had described. I noted beside each incident what had actually happened from my perspective, in as much detail as I could reconstruct, not to argue. I was not writing this for an argument, to have a record of the two versions existing side by side so that I could look at the gap between them clearly. Over the following 3 years, I added to the document, not regularly, not obsessively. There were months when I did not open it at all. But when something happened that seemed relevant, I noted it. The date, the specifics, the context. I noted a Christmas where Sophie said, in front of her husband and his family, that I had never really been there for Mom. Said it lightly, as a fact. The way you state something that does not require support because everyone already agrees with it. I noted the Thanksgiving where my mother began to cry midway through dinner in a way that had a particular quality to it. Not the cry of someone overwhelmed by feeling, but the cry of someone who is determined that crying will produce a useful result. I noted how the table turned toward me. I noted that I had done nothing in the previous 20 minutes that could reasonably have produced the crying. I noted a phone call from a cousin I had not spoken to in 4 years, who called out of nowhere and said she had heard I had completely cut off the family and wanted to check on me. She had heard this from my mother. She had been calling, I understood, because my mother had told her to be concerned, because a concerned cousin was useful to a narrative in which I had abandoned everyone. I thanked the cousin for calling. I told her I was fine. I noted the call in the document. 3 years of notes, not a catalog of grievances. I want to be clear about that. A record. The specific, dated, accurate record of a person who had understood that the story being told about her was not her story, and who had decided to write her own down so that she would have it. I had not cut off the family. I had pulled back from a relationship with my mother that required me to be a specific kind of daughter that I could not be. I maintained contact. Birthdays, major holidays, the significant events. I had attended Sophie's engagement party. I had attended her wedding. I was at the baby shower. And Sophie had said in front of 22 women that I should be grateful they had even invited me. Now I need you to stop for just a second, because I need you to feel the weight of that sentence in that room. A baby shower is a specific kind of event. It is a celebration. It is full of goodwill and softness and the particular vulnerability of a woman who is about to become a mother. I had brought a gift. I had dressed nicely. I had come. And my sister, in front of everyone, had used it as a moment to remind me of my place in this family's story. Not because she is evil, because she had been told a story for 20-some years and believed it fully, and had, in the looseness of a happy afternoon surrounded by people who loved her, said the things she actually thought. That is sometimes more devastating than cruelty. Cruelty you can argue with. Genuine belief is harder. Drop a comment if you know exactly what I mean. And if you've been the person in your family that everyone has a version of, the version they received without you in the room, I need you to subscribe. Because what happened when that yellow paper came off the gift is something I want you to see. I had started writing the card 6 weeks before the shower, not because I had planned the shower as a moment. I want to be clear about that, because I know how the sequence of events sounds. I had not sat down with a calendar and planned a confrontation. I had simply been writing things for a while, processing things on paper, the way I had processed things since I was 12 years old, letters I did not send, thoughts I needed to make linear by putting them into sentences, the ordinary private practice of a person who thinks by writing. One evening in March, I had sat down and started a letter to Sophie. Not to send, just to know what I would say if I could say it without the defenses up, without the accumulated history of the room between us. The letter had gone through many versions over the following weeks. The first version was angry. It was detailed in the way that angry letters are detailed. It itemized, it proved, it argued. It made its case with the thoroughness of someone who has been building a case for years and has finally found the moment to present it. It was entirely accurate and entirely useless, because accurate arguments made in anger do not land in the way you need them to land. They land as attacks. They produce defense rather than understanding. I let that version sit for 3 days, then I deleted most of it. The second version was too soft. I had overcorrected. In trying to remove the anger, I had removed the substance. It read like an apology for existing, which was not what I intended and was not. I had finally understood what I owed. The third version arrived one night at around 11 p.m., when I was tired enough that I had stopped editing and was simply writing. This was the version that sounded like me, not the me who was managing the impression I was making, the me who had been 9 years old when our father left and had helped take care of a 6-year-old Sophie, while our mother processed her grief loudly and had never expected a thank you and had not gotten one and had loved Sophie fiercely anyway. That version I kept. The letter had gone through many versions. The first version was angry. What I wanted Sophie to know was this. I wanted her to know that I had loved her our whole lives, that I had been her sister in every way I knew how to be, even when the ways were limited by the things that were happening around us, that I had changed her diapers when she was an infant and our mother was struggling, that I had defended her in school when she was 12 and some girls were unkind to her, that I had driven 4 hours to her city when her first serious relationship ended and she needed someone to be there. I wanted her to know that I understood why she believed the things she believed about me, that she had received information from a source she trusted, and that I could not, from the outside, tell her she was wrong in a way she could hear, because telling someone their trusted source is wrong is not a conversation you can win with logic. I wanted her to know that I had been keeping records, not to use them against her, not to prosecute my own case or to make her feel guilty or to demand anything from her, but because I had spent years being made smaller in rooms I wasn't in, and I needed her to know that I knew, that I had been paying attention, that I was not the version of me she had been given, and I wanted her to know something else, something specific, the thing that had taken me 3 years of notes to see clearly. I had found in the records I had kept a pattern, not a hidden pattern. It was visible once you assembled the timeline, once you laid the events beside each other in the order they had actually occurred. But nobody else had assembled the timeline because nobody else had been sitting outside the story long enough and with sufficient distance from it to see its shape. The pattern was this. My mother told people about me directly before she needed something from them. It was consistent, not every time. I am not claiming she was consciously calculating every conversation, but the timing, across a decade of notes, was not random. Before she asked my Aunt Patricia for money to cover a car repair, she had called her and described at length how I had abandoned her, how difficult things were, how alone she was, how her older daughter had let her down. The call for money came the following week. The guilt had been established first. Before she had asked a cousin to drive her to a medical appointment, she had mentioned at a family gathering that I had never really been there for her. The cousin had agreed, sympathetically. The request came 3 days later. Before she had asked Sophie to move closer to home, the conversation that had produced, in Sophie, the guilt-shaped obligation that had defined her relationship with our mother for the past 4 years, she had spent 2 months telling Sophie what I had failed to do, what I had not been, how she managed all alone, because Vivian had always been so difficult. The move had happened. Sophie had moved 40 minutes from our mother's house, and not from the city she had lived in happily for 6 years. She had made this choice because she loved our mother, yes, but she had made it from a guilt that had been specifically cultivated. I was not the villain in these stories accidentally. I was the villain because a villain was structurally necessary. My mother's narrative, the narrative of the woman who had sacrificed everything and been let down, required someone who had done the letting down. I had been the available candidate. I had been the candidate who had stopped performing gratitude, which made me the candidate who could be assigned the non-performance as a grievance. The candidacy had been made permanent by 20 years of repetition. I had found this pattern in my notes. I had dated the entries. I had the timeline. I put it in the card. The card said all of this. Not angrily, in the voice of someone who has finished being angry and has arrived somewhere more permanent. The place where the truth is not a weapon, but a fact. and facts can be given as gifts if you give them carefully. I had put the card in a yellow envelope. I had put the envelope inside the gift. A soft blanket for the baby. Something practical, the kind of gift that gets used. I had not put my name on the outside. I had written my name at the bottom of the card. I wanted her to get to the end before she knew who had written it. The gift pile was large. Sophie went through them in order. The gifts from her mother-in-law, from her college friends, from the women at her office. She was gracious at each one, holding things up, reading names aloud, saying thank you in the specific way of someone who means it and has been taught well. The yellow gift was near the bottom. She picked it up. She turned it over looking for a tag. There was none. She glanced around the room. No one raised their hand. She shrugged, the way you shrug at an anonymous gift, pleasantly curious, and she unwrapped it. The blanket was on top. She held it up, cream-colored, soft, a small pattern of animals along the border. She said, "Oh, this is beautiful," and showed it to the room. Several women agreed. Someone asked where it was from. Sophie set it aside and reached into the box for the card. She opened the envelope. I watched her face from across the room. She read the card with the expression of someone who is reading something casually, not yet expecting anything in particular. The expression lasted approximately 30 seconds. Then it changed. Her face did not go through a dramatic sequence. It did not collapse or flush or display anger in a visible way. It simply tightened. The way a face tightens when it is receiving information it is not prepared for and is using all available resources to stay composed. She read to the end. She read my name. She looked up. She looked directly at me across the room. Not at the other women, not at her mother-in-law, not at any of the 22 other people in that room. At me. Her hands were shaking, not with rage. I want to be precise about this. Not the shaking of someone who is furious, the shaking of someone who has just been given something that is going to require them to rebuild something. The shaking that happens when the ground shifts. She held the card for a long moment. Nobody in the room said anything. The room had taken on the quality it had taken on earlier, the suspended quality, the held breath. But this time it was different. This time nobody seemed quite sure what they had just witnessed, because nothing visible had happened. A woman had opened a gift and read a card and was sitting very still. I said nothing. I did not explain. I did not look. Away. I sat with my sparkling water, and I looked at my sister. My sister, who was 28 weeks pregnant and who had spent 20-some years believing a version of me that was not mine, and I let her sit with the card. After a moment, she put it face down on the table beside her. She said to the room, "Sorry, just a minute." She excused herself. She went to the hallway. Her mother-in-law raised her eyebrows at no one in particular. Someone suggested they moved a cake. The shower swirled back into motion. I sat where I was. Sophie came back 10 minutes later. She had composed herself. Her face was still tighter than it had been at the beginning of the shower, but she was composed. She sat back down. She thanked everyone for coming. She held the blanket up again for a photo. She was, in the specific way of people who have been raised well, capable of returning to the surface of things even when something has happened underneath. She did not look at me again for the rest of the shower. I helped clean up afterward because I had always helped clean up. I was stacking plates in the kitchen when she came in. We were alone. She said, "I read it." I said, "I know." She said, "All of it?" "All of it." She stood at the counter and she held the edge of it with both hands, the way people hold counters when they need to be holding something. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Is it true?" I said, "Which part?" She said, "The part about Mom, the pattern you described." I said, "Yes." She was quiet again. "I didn't know about Aunt Patricia's money," she said. "I didn't know Mom had told her those things before she asked." "There's a lot you didn't know," I said. "Not because you didn't care, because you weren't in the room for it." She turned to look at me. Her eyes were wet. "I said something terrible to you," she said, "at the shower, in front of everyone." "Yes. I've said things like that before, not always out loud." I know. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. Then she lowered it. I believed her, she said. I genuinely believed her. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I thought you had actually... She stopped. She tried again. I thought you had chosen to be this way, with the family. I know you believed her, I said. That's what the card was trying to explain. You were given a version of me, over a very long time, by a person you trusted. And that version wasn't wrong because you are a bad person. It was wrong because the person who gave it to you had reasons to give it that way. She was quiet. The part about Sophie moving closer to home, she said, yes. She told me you had refused to help, that she was doing everything alone. I was 40 minutes away by train, I said. I offered 3 times in the 6 months before you moved to come and stay for a weekend. She said she was fine. Sophie looked at the counter. She needed you to feel like she needed you, I said. That's different from needing you, she said. She loves us. I know she does, I said. That's true. And people can love you and still arrange the world in ways that serve them. Both things can be true at the same time. Holding both is very uncomfortable. Most people choose one over the other. She was quiet for a long time. I chose her version, she said. You trusted her, I said. That's not the same thing. She looked at me. Something in her face had changed. The tightness from earlier still there, but underneath it something else. The specific expression of someone who is updating something they have believed for a long time and is finding the updating both necessary and expensive. I'm not ready to talk about all of it, she said. Not today. I know, I said, but I'm going to think about it. That's enough, I said. That's more than I expected today. She was quiet again. Outside, in the living room, we could hear the last few guests saying their goodbyes. She said, "What do you want from me?" I thought about this. I had thought about it, actually, before the shower, before the card. I had tried to be honest with myself about what I wanted, because the wanting matters more than the wanting to be right. I said, I want you to know me, not the version she gave you, me. I want to be your sister without the story in the way. She looked at me for a long time. I don't know if I can undo what I believe, she said. Not all at once. I'm not asking for all at once, I said. I'm asking for the possibility. She nodded, small, unsteady. I picked up the last stack of plates and put them in the dishwasher. Sophie called me 2 weeks after the shower. She said she had been thinking. She said she had called Aunt Patricia. She said that Aunt Patricia had confirmed some things that the card had described, and that the confirmation had been, her word, clarifying. She said she was not ready to have a full conversation about all of it. She said she was pregnant and exhausted and processing something large and she needed time. She said she thought I deserved to know she was processing it. I said, I'd take your time. The baby was born 6 weeks later, a girl. Sophie texted me a photo, just a photo, no words, in the middle of the night from the hospital. The baby had Sophie's nose and her husband Daniel's ears and the specific squished expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere and is not sure yet what they think of it. I texted back, she's perfect. Sophie texted, thank you for coming. She did not mean the shower. She meant it in the larger sense, for still being there, for not having left in the years when leaving would have been easier and more defensible. I said, I'm not going anywhere. I have met the baby twice. The first time was at the hospital 2 days after the birth. I brought nothing. I had already given the blanket, just myself, which felt like the right offering for a first meeting. Sophie was exhausted in the way of someone who has just done the hardest physical thing of their life and is still vibrating with the enormity of it. She looked at me when I came in, and the look was not complicated. It was tired and open, and something I had not seen from her in a long time. She held out the baby. I held her daughter for 7 minutes, standing by the window of the hospital room while Sophie rested with her eyes closed. The baby was very small and very certain of her own existence. She had that quality that newborns have, of absolute presence, of being entirely here in a way that does not require anything of you. I looked at her and thought, you have no story yet. No version of anyone has been installed in you. You are meeting everyone for the first time. I held her and thought, I would like to be the aunt you actually know. The second time was at Sophie's house, a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks after the birth. Her husband was there. It was brief. The baby needed to sleep and Sophie needed to sleep, and the afternoon had the specific, exhausted quality of new parent afternoons. But Sophie had texted to say come by, which was different from previous years, when my presence at their house had been arranged around occasions rather than offered freely. Both times have been brief and careful, the early meetings of people who are learning how to be around each other without the old architecture between them. Sophie watches me differently now, not with suspicion, not with the particular blindness of someone who has received a version and accepted it as complete, with a new attention, the attention of someone who is revising their understanding of a person and is not quite sure yet what the revised version looks like. That revision is slow. I do not rush it. I have learned in 31 years that rushing people toward a truth they are not ready for produces nothing except defensiveness. The truth has to be offered and then allowed to sit. It has to be something the other person picks up on their own terms when they are ready. Sophie is picking it up. I will wait for as long as it takes. My mother does not know about the card. I do not know if Sophie has told her. I have not asked. My relationship with my mother continues as it has continued. The maintained distance, the birthday calls, the careful navigation of the thing between us that has no clean resolution. My mother is 61 years old, and she is who she is, and I am not going to change her, and the time when I believed I could is a long way behind me. What I have is the possibility that my sister is meeting me for the first time, not the version of me she was given. Me, Vivian, 31, who defends her in school at 12 and drives 4 hours when a relationship ends and shows up to the baby shower and sits with her sparkling water, and does not perform gratitude when she should not be grateful and keeps records for 3 years, and writes a card that takes 4 days to decide whether to send. That Vivian, that is who I am. She is starting to know her. I want to tell you one last thing. The card did not say anything shocking. It did not reveal secrets or expose wrongdoing or produce a dramatic confrontation. It said the truth as I knew it, in the voice of someone who had finished being angry about it and had arrived somewhere quieter. It said, here is what I have seen. Here is what I have recorded. Here is the pattern. And here is who I have been all along, while you were receiving a different version. That is all a card can do. It cannot undo years. It cannot revise a story that has been running for decades. It cannot make someone believe something they have not yet chosen to look at. What it can do is open a door. My sister is standing at the door. I am not going to push her through. I am going to wait for as long as it takes at the other side. The door was always there. I just put the handle within reach. If you have been the difficulty in your family's story, the one whose name is attached to the hard things, the one who is made smaller in rooms you are not in, I want you to know that you are allowed to correct the record, not loudly, not with a confrontation designed for an audience, with a card, if that is what fits, with a phone call, with a letter, with a document you keep for 3 years and then fold into yellow paper and put in the pile with the other gifts. You do not have to carry other people's version of you in silence. You are allowed to say, that is not who I am. Here is who I am. Say it, in whatever form fits, to whoever is ready to hear it. Someone eventually will be ready. Thank you for staying with me through this one. Leave me a comment. Tell me if you have a card you haven't sent yet. I'll see you in the next one.